All right, good morning, family. Let's go ahead and begin. If you wouldn't mind walking over to your seats, grab a seat, settle in. We're going to change the dialogue and change the conversation to topic number 2. So this morning we started with risk factors for firefighters. Now we're moving on our discussion to topic number 2, where we examine exposures and survivorship. So this morning we're going to transition into talking about an important topic in the fire service, which is PFAS and its relationship to cancer. We'll then follow that topic or discussion with an update from our colleagues at the World Trade Center as they celebrate the 20th year anniversary with Dr. Prezan and Dr. Zig Owens. And then we'll invite our colleagues from the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center to talk about firefighter cancer survivorship with Dr. Pinedo and Dr. Natasha Schaefer-Sali. So we begin this discussion with looking at this topic of PFAS. And I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jaclyn Goodrich, who is currently a research assistant professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Michigan. Dr. Goodrich received her doctorate in toxicology from the University of Michigan and focused her postdoctoral training on environmental epidemiology and epigenetics. Dr. Goodrich's research aims to identify environmental factors, including from occupational and environmental sources, that contribute to disease susceptibility in vulnerable populations. Exposures of interest include per- and perfluoroalkyl substances, say that really fast 10 times, heavy metals, phthalates, and phenols. Dr. Goodrich's research includes investigating epigenetics as a potential mechanism to be able to link exposures to adverse health outcomes. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and research partner, Dr. Jackie Goodrich.
Thanks for having me here. As Alberto said, now I'm going to talk about something completely different. You heard this morning a lot about, lifestyle factors and some behaviors that could be, potentially changed to improve health outcomes for firefighters. And today I'm going to talk about some exposures that we know are hazardous that we hope to change more at a policy level to protect more people, so you don't have to, individuals don't have to decide if they're exposed to this or not and worry about it. So today, I hope to talk to you that you'll learn a couple of things: what PFAS are and where they might come from, how you might be exposed to them. I'll also be telling you a little bit about the health risks that we know about these chemicals can cause, including some cancers. And then I'll give you a little bit of a few results on some research that we're doing in a cohort of firefighters currently looking at this and looking at epigenetics as a possible marker linking PFAS to health outcomes. So briefly, what are PFAS? I'm just going to call it PFAS from now on because, I don't want to say those long words too many times. I can't even barely say them. But this is a class of chemicals that were developed in the 40s or 50s because it was kind of discovered by accident, but they had these amazing properties. There's 9,000 of them, and although there's a couple of dozen that are often used in industry, but there's tons of different versions of them, and they're used in all kinds of products to make them either flame retardant, grease resistant, water resistant. They have all these great properties. So because of that, they're used in lots and lots of things. They're in, food packaging, they're in waterproof raincoats. Because of environmental contamination, though, they also end up in our water and in fish and in wildlife that people eat. And they're what we call forever chemicals, so most of them are really hard to break down. So once they get into the environment or into people, they kind of stay there, nearly forever. But why are we talking about this here today? Of course, everyone in the general population can get exposed from things like contaminated water or personal products that have these in them. But we're talking about this here today because there are several types of occupational exposure for firefighters to PFAS as well. So I'm sure many of you know what is going on in this picture. This is some foam being sprayed, probably in a training fire in this instance. And AFFF foams, specifically Class B foams, contain PFAS, at least historically. Now, different states are making, laws about them. So some states are using AFFF foams that don't have these chemicals in them anymore, but most departments will at least have some historical PFAS-containing foams that they use, most especially, aircraft, fire and rescue, fire departments, and places like that. And there's a lot of debate about what can it be replaced with instead, since we know that it's toxic, and that's still an ongoing area, and I'd be happy to talk to some of you about that later. So I would say the main source is, potentially through foams for anyone that uses PFAS-containing glass beam foams. But there's actually also PFAS in a lot of gear because of its flame-resistant properties. There's PFAS in gear, and there's some work going on right now to figure out if it can actually leach out of the gear and get into people. I think that's an area we're still not quite sure. It might not really absorb through the skin very well, which would be a good thing. But there's some people in the government looking at whether, it can when it's under high heat stress and stuff like that. And then because there's PFAS in so many products, even things like couches and carpets, if you go to a structure fire, it's, possible that a firefighter can be exposed there as well when these products are, burning and up in flames. And then, of course, there's the typical sources like water, and sometimes the drinking water source around a fire department might be contaminated with PFAS just because of, historical foam use in that area. And then it's even been found that within a fire department, there can be little bits of PFAS in the dust, and people can be exposed that way too, just because it sloughs off from gear or, other things that have PFAS in them. So why is this even a problem? If it wasn't a toxic chemical, who cares? But we know a lot about PFAS in general from this really big, industrial incident that happened in Ohio. So this is a map here of the Mid-Ohio River Valley, and it was discovered, I think in the 90s, that this company DuPont had a plant there, and they were basically continuously contaminating this river with a PFAS called PFOA, and its chemical structure is pictured at the top. And when this was finally discovered, there was this really long, drawn-out lawsuit because people in the community knew they were getting sick and possibly cancer from it and things like that. And eventually, there was this big class action lawsuit for the whole community, and it ended up in, the company having to clean up the PFAS in the environment, but also conducting this 60,000-person study on the effects of PFAS, which is really big for this kind of research. That almost never happens. So with that huge, huge study, we found out that this chemical, PFOA, could be linked to high cholesterol, some immune diseases like ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, and pregnancy, and cancer. Specifically, there was the best evidence for kidney and testicular cancer. And if you're interested in this, there's actually a book that the lawyer wrote and also a Hollywood movie about it. So if you want to learn more of those two things are pretty interesting. And so building off of that work, other people have looked at these chemicals in cancer too, not in firefighters, but in general populations that are exposed to them from contaminated water and stuff like that. And this group called the International Agency for Research on Cancer tries to put together all this research and figure out what's hazardous and what's not so that, governments can make decisions about it and ban things and stuff like that. And in 2017, they decided there was enough evidence to show that this one PFAS is is a possible carcinogen. It's really hard to prove these things, but that it's linked to kidney and testicular cancer, and there's ongoing investigations now to look at this and other PFAS, since there's so many of them, and if they're linked to a series of other cancers that are listed there, because they haven't been as well studied. So we're not sure yet, but there's some evidence that it's linked to quite a few other cancers as well. And I know you can't really see this, but this is just to show all that evidence so far was mostly for one PFAS that we call PFOA, but there's all these other ones, and they have different structures, and the chemical structure makes some of them more toxic than others, some of them less toxic, some of them don't stay around in your body forever, some of them stay a lot longer. And so there's an urgent need right now, really, to figure out how toxic all of these are, and to, there's some call to ban or replace all of them with something entirely different, but that's, and those are policies that our research in this area is always trying to inform, because we don't want anyone to have to decide what product they buy and whether it's safe and contains the right kind of PFAS or not. We just want it to be safe when you get it. And that leads us to just a small example of some of this research that we're doing in firefighters to look at PFAS. So I've been working with a firefighter cancer cohort study, who you're going to hear about a little bit later in the afternoon too. And that's a big study that ultimately aims to enroll 10,000 firefighters and follow them for, if we can keep it funded, 20 or 30 years, and look at lots of exposures, including to PFAS, but look at exposures and modifiable other risk factors and see what can be done to prevent cancer. What things can we change, what things, could we ban if necessary, and stuff like that. And so this timeline here just shows, where we are in the process. Right now there's, 2,000 to 3,000 people that are enrolled, and we're going to start following people up soon. And some of you may even be involved in this study. And I think you'll hear more about this later too, but this is just to show, I'm talking about PFAS today, but in general, we know obviously firefighters are exposed to lots and lots of things. Some of them you even heard about are chemicals or things like sleep disruption that can be problematic. And these are all factors that we're considering in the study and basically trying to identify things that are harmful that could be reduced, and also identify mechanisms and prevention strategies that could protect people, with the ultimate goal of preventing cancer later on. So what are we doing with PFAS? And this picture shows a couple of things that we're doing. And we're expanding this, over time. But so far, we've done a pretty in-depth PFAS analysis in some structural firefighters, as well as some firefighters from ARFF departments. And I'll show you some of those results in a minute, what we've seen so far. And we're also looking at comparing PFAS levels and health outcomes in new firefighters compared to, a couple of years into the job, to see if those levels change, if their exposure increases from the job. And then we also work with some people at the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety who test some of these chemicals, in cells and in animal models and stuff like that, to see in a more experimental lab-based method which ones of these chemicals are more toxic than others. So looking at the results of what we've seen so far, and I'll explain this. So these are box plots where the line in the middle shows the average level for the group of people that we're looking at, and let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, so these are different PFAS that we measured, 9 of them in firefighters. Each of these colored boxes, except for the purple one, represents the average from one of 4 departments that we measured them in, and then the purple box is basically the US average. It's a study of the average US population. And from this graph, the main takeaway point is that it's a little hard to tell from looking at this, but when we compare the firefighters to the general population, there was 3 of the PFAS, which we know are 3 that are quite toxic, were a little bit higher in some departments, in the firefighters from some departments compared to the general US population. And these are municipal structural firefighters. When we looked at the aircraft fire and rescue firefighters, we saw, I don't think I have a box to go over it, but we saw the same 3 were a little more elevated compared to the general population, and some departments there maybe seem to be more exposure than others. But this is something we're following up on and measuring in more of the people that we have in that big study. And then this is just to show too, we want to give something back when we do this research, and so we usually share the PFAS results, even though there's not really anything you can do about it necessarily if you know that you have a high level, but we like to give the results back, and in the context of, how are you compared to the US population, compared to the other firefighters we measured, so that, people can start thinking about, is there a way to reduce exposure in their station. And I'll just go, I know we need to catch up a little bit on time today, but I'll just go over really quickly over something that we do on the health outcome side. So obviously, we enrolled healthy firefighters. They, fortunately don't have cancer. And if they get cancer, it's not going to develop for many years. So we want to find biomarkers, something we can measure in the body that will tell us there's a health problem and there's a higher risk for cancer earlier on, so that we can try to, prevent it, bring in some prevention strategies, and also that can inform the risk regulation of these chemicals too. But what is a biomarker? So here, there's different ways to define it, but one way to think about it is a chemical or some kind of chemical reacting with something that's always in your body, some cellular component that you can measure in a human sample. And there's a lot of reasons to use these biomarkers. As I was saying, there might be subtle changes that happen in your body before you get cancer. And there's ways that, we can use biomarkers both to measure exposure. We can measure exposure to PFAS in serum, some other things we can measure in urine. There's also biomarkers of effect, looking at these cellular changes that are happening before you get disease. And then ultimately, we want to use this information to figure out who's more susceptible to disease later so that we can do something about it. So one type of biomarker that I use is called epigenetics. This is something that regulates your gene expression. It's not your genetic code, but it's it's what turns it on and off. So it's really, an exquisite thing, and it's responsive to the environment, and it changes a lot in disease. And, it's this really important in-between cellular mechanism that links everything that comes into your body and how, your body responds. And there's different types of it, but what I'll talk about today is something called DNA methylation. And so why do we want to measure this DNA methylation as an epigenetic biomarker in firefighters? We know that firefighters have an increased risk for some cancers. We know that occupational exposures could contribute to this risk because, especially in this case, things like PFAS have also been linked to cancers. But why the epigenome? We know from other research that these environmental exposures can change the epigenome. And when it makes that change, it's something that's fairly permanent. So if it makes a change in one cell, when that cell divides to make a new one, the change goes to the next cell too, and it keeps propagating on. And if it's in an important gene, say it turns off a gene that you need to protect yourself against cancer, then this is a problem in the long run. So now we've established that the epigenome is responsive to the environment. And we won't talk about this today, but we know there's big epigenetic changes in cancer. So basically, we want to look at this because it could be this biomarker that links your exposures like PFAS to disease later on, and something we can use to figure out how toxic those things are and to do something about it. And I'll just show you really quickly 2 results of how we use this for. So one way we can use it is to look at something called Epigenetic Age, and we wanted to look in firefighters and see if PFAS accelerate your epigenetic age. So why would that matter? So epigenetic age is this marker that's really linked to biological age. So you can be, 40 years old, but maybe your biological age is more like 35 and you're healthier, or maybe your biological age is more closer to 45, and if that's the case, you're at a higher risk for a lot of diseases. And this has been something that's been established in, a lot of big studies of adults. So we wanted to look at this as a marker, as a screener. Are some of these exposures like PFAS, do they accelerate biological age, which we know is bad for a lot of downstream outcomes? And the good thing is we also know of some things like physical activity that can improve your biological age. So there's ways to, potentially counteract this in the long run. And so to do this, we looked at about 200 structural firefighters from 3 departments, and we measured this epigenetic mark, and we measured PFAS. And then we looked at the link between the two. So we used some statistical modeling, and this shows the main results. Basically, the take-home point is these are different markers of that epigenetic biological age. There's different ways you can measure it. These are different PFAS, and then within each row shows if they're linked or not. If it's blue and in bold, then that's something we don't want to see. That means that PFAS is linked to a worse, accelerated biological age. So we did see that with 3 PFAS, including 2 of the ones that had been elevated in the firefighters compared to the general population. And in our second question, we get data not only on this, but on every gene in the body, and genes have functions for all kinds of diseases. So we looked to see if PFAS were linked to this regulatory pattern at all genes using this big technology where we get huge data. And what we found out, basically after really stringent quality control and statistical cutoffs, we found some sites and some PFAS that were linked to changes in methylation. And when we look at the genes of what those are in, they were definitely enriched in genes that we know are important for cancer processes, and some that are related to immune function too. And these PFAS chemicals have also been linked to immune suppression and some other immune problems. And I'll just skip that. But the take-home message from today, so I can buy a tiny bit of time, is that hopefully you've learned that PFAS are these chemicals that are everywhere. And, everyone, in the U.S. is exposed to them in some way, but firefighters might be exposed to them in additional ways depending on how much foam they handle or what's in their station and things like that. And in a study of firefighters, we saw that there was a link between some of these commonly measured PFAS with accelerated biological age, which is a bad thing. And we also found some altered methylation at specific genes. And ultimately, we want to use this information. We want to look into this more to figure out if these are biomarkers we can use to screen people for risk, or to try to, push more on the regulators and, in general, get PFAS more regulated and replaced with healthier things if it's possible. And that's, in general, in line with the long-term goals of our whole study, is not just for PFAS, but trying to identify all of the main, maybe most hazardous exposures that firefighters have so they can be reduced, and that, also couple that with some intervention strategies and, some maybe lifestyle modifications like people were talking about this morning that can improve health. So, you can counterbalance what's bad and what's good and overall protect health and decrease risk for cancer and other diseases. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the team, many of which are here today. This is funded by a few sources and is run by many, many excellent fire service partners, as well as Dr. Jeff Burgess and Alberto Caban Martinez and other partners at universities around the U.S. And maybe I have time for a question. We'll see.
Okay, that was fantastic, Dr. Goodrich. Thank you. It made the information very accessible. So we will have a few minutes to ask some questions here from the audience in the room, or for those of you online. If anybody would like to ask Dr. Goodrich a question about PFAS and cancer, I invite you to come up to these mics up here on the front of the stage and ask your question, or if there's any questions online that we should entertain. Okay.
I've got one.
Question for you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I have one also online. Go for it.
Sorry, I know you mentioned the research into the turnout gear with the PFAS is kind of early on. Is there? I'm obviously not going to pin you to it. Is there any sort of rough timeline on when that stuff will be ready?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not 100% sure, but I know some of it, at least some of the work they're doing in more of a model system, is well underway and probably could be out in the next year or so. But I know there's some other groups that I don't work with that are also, doing some other experiments too, and I'm not quite sure how far those are along. But I would think there'd be some, publicly available information about it out in probably at least the year, at least preliminary evidence.
Thank you.
Okay, I got a question for you from online. So in this slide that you presented on the firefighter cancer cohort study, like the research concepts, under the prevention, pathway, you have listed treatment. Can you explain why treatment is listed if we're trying to prevent cancer?
That is a great question, and something maybe that shouldn't be on my slide, but that's often just on there. I think, in this case, intervention would actually be a better word, because if we're talking about people that don't have cancer yet, but that we think are at a high risk, then things like certain kinds of diets and maybe even physical activity regimes and stuff like that are being developed as, preventive to cancer. Mm-hmm. So I think that's more what I'm thinking of. And, farther down the line, if we understand what some of these genes are that change, it's possible a therapeutic, some kind of drug could be developed for people who are, more like actually starting to develop cancer. So that would be more of an actual early cancer treatment. Mm-hmm. So there's some possibilities there too.
Absolutely, yeah. It gives the full 37,000 foot view. Yep. Any other questions here from the, yep.
Dr. Goodrich, I've got a question for you. PFAS is found in a lot of stuff inside the house. When the house is on fire, does it become friable? Does it become released into the smoke? Is that part of that process? I was just curious. So it's like asbestos. Once it's heated up and disturbed, is it friable, or is it out in the atmosphere? I was just curious to see if that's...
Yeah, that's a great question. You cannot degrade PFAS by burning it. So, most of PFAS at least, some of them, but most of the kind of commonly used ones, when it burns, it will it will get released. So, it could get out into the atmosphere and get and deposit somewhere. Some of it could be breathed in, but yeah, it won't burn up and degrade.
So basically, it's part of the smoky atmosphere and part of those toxicants that are sticking to us and we're exposed to.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Orman?
So for the blood serum measurements, we always compare it to NHANES study. Has there been any comparisons to the local averages of the population? We have a center at NC State that looks at the Gen X contamination in the Cape Fear region from Chemours. And so it's so localized depending on where something was made. I just wanted to know if we try to include that population as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And right now, the departments that we measured it in were from 3 states, and we haven't compared it to averages from those states, but that's a good idea to do, because even within the city, for instance, one of our departments, it could have just been that their public water supply is more contaminated, and then that would mean it would be entirely an environmental exposure and not occupational. So yeah, we do need to keep considering that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That NHANES only gives us national data, and we need normative local data. So that's an excellent point. Dave, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, is it possible to determine from the PFAS marker that you're finding in the blood where it came from, whether it's water, whether it's from PTFE or some other source?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I suppose if we found one that was more rare, since there's so many different types, then we might say, well, we know that one's only really found in X product. But for most of them, there's the method that we use, you can't trace exactly where it came from, and we know that it's found in various things. So at this point, the best we could do is probably link it to, by asking people, how much foam do you use, where do you get your water from, and kind of linking together all this information to infer where it came from.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I guess some questions from online. I think that's it. We got all of our questions. All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodrich.